I work at a maximum security prison and we have several inmates who are severely mentally ill. The ones that self-harm wear a Fitbit kind of thing to monitor heart rate. If there is a change we rush their room to stop whatever is happening. On top of this we also do visual inspections. On one round a coworker was doing cell checks and noticed this particular inmate had blood on their face but nothing came up on the monitors or anything. So he called to the inmates to ask if they were okay. The inmate had their eyes closed and just kept repeating, "It doesn't hurt." The inmate would not answer where the blood was from. We opened the cell to see what the situation was, and it turns out the inmate had plucked out both of their eyes and they were laying on the floor. The inmate's hour monitor never alerted and the inmate never screamed. Paramedics said the inmate's vitals were normal and the inmate was fully responsive. I worked for U-Haul when I was 18, and it was located in front of a club that was known for being really sketchy. I came in to open one morning, and it was common for people to knock on the door hoping to get in early and get their truck. On this day, I hear frantic knocking on the door. I'm there alone still so it kind of startled me. I look and there's a woman, completely naked, covered in what looks like blood. I called the cops and grabbed one of the moving blankets and went outside to cover her up. She smelled really bad and was a mess. Ended up being blood and her own shit she was covered in. Found out later she was drugged at the club that night/early morning, raped and left, blacked out in the alley. It was just a fucked up and surreal situation to be involved in. I was in a crappy motel. The room had bed bugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring, then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch/ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. Edited to @ I was in a rush when I wrote this, so you should definitely read more into the story. It's crazy. From the horrific act itself, to the court proceedings, to the fact that he hardly served any time. I've posted this before, but mine, when I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typical social team, out for beers and pizza, after with the guys, family event type thing. My parents were good friends with two of the other couples, both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other two couples had left their kids at one of their houses, with a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night, but I was being fussy and my mom nixed the idea, though they would 100% have normally gone back to hang out. Well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. Two men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. Took the parents hostage as well, and made the dads drive with them to banks/a grocery store, where one dad was manager, and clear out accounts/a safe. They then came back to the house and slaughtered both families, the babysitter and her boyfriend, kids included. They caught the two guys later on. My dad attended the trials and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day too. Edit. Wow, you guys are amazing detectives. I have been telling this story for years, and this is the first time I have been made aware that it wasn't me as a baby. It was my sister, 9 years older, born in 72. My dad has been telling me this story wrong for as long as I can remember. Sorry for the confusion, all. Years ago when I was 8, my family lived in this big weird house kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs I looked, and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door, and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months I didn't tell my family, because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost, and didn't think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800-900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I've ever had. Edit. Whoa, this blew up way more than I expected. I'm doing my best to respond to comments/questions. Sorry if I end up missing yours. Told this here before but once more. My friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple derelict cars parked up near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room, coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go to the window, there would be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote, or whatever. He kept hearing the noise, so he'd go outside to look around, but would find nothing. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon, he started claiming that he was hearing voices coming from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property, but would find nothing. It was persistent, so he'd started calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around and would find nothing. So they told him he needed to stop calling them for this and perhaps get a security camera or whatever. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cig out and snuck around to the front and got there just in time to see the doors to his derelict conversion van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, that is without lights/sirens, and when they approached the van, the doors swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that people were shooting up in there. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. I used to run the boilers in a dough building. Apparently at some point in the 80s, 3 people were murdered over involvement in a big VCR theft. VCRs meant for the school system had apparently been stolen out of this warehouse. It was an inside job. Something went wrong. The head custodian was found shot to death. And later the bodies of the other 2 were reported buried in Monticello but wordies. They had first been incinerated. In the boilers I was in charge of operating and maintaining. There were 3 operational boilers, and 1 that wasn't in service. No clue which one was supposedly used, but when you're firing them up, you're typically the only person in the building. Not a single day went by that I fired them up and didn't wonder which one was used. But that wasn't what gave me the real heebie-jeebies. You have to clean the interior of these boilers really well, otherwise the fire won't transfer heat to the water very efficiently, especially with H6 oil. These boilers would build up a lot of soot. You have to suit up in a Tyvek suit, wear a mask, and climb right into the firebox. I found myself staring down the business end of that burner many times, wondering what that panic would feel like. I'm reasonably sure these people were dead before getting put in the boiler though. Once, I was actually in one boiler, while another one was running. The valve that isolated my boiler from the main steam line wasn't holding, and by the time I realized how warm it was getting, it was enough to panic trying to lift myself up and belly crawl through the small opening. The metal was almost too hot to keep my hands on for long. Definitely creepy experience, considering the history of that boiler room. I'll tell you one that happened to me, or rather, I was witness to. One night, I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, New York. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came flying past the bar. The car burned through a red light and started going up this hill that was on a curve. We watched as he veered over the double yellow and smashed head on with another car coming from the other direction. Both cars' hind ends lifted up, then slammed down. The car that was driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside and grabbed the fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911 and say there has been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and me ran to the cars. Now, I used to think this was a fictional trope, but I was pretty drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me up instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and heat were awful, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part was, and this will haunt me forever, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she died. My god, it was the worst sound ever. The fire department came and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The rotten motherfucker driving the other car was some rich drunk cocksucker. He lost a leg, but otherwise was physically unharmed. I have no clue if he did time, as I left to go back home a day or so later. I'm trying to find a link for the news story, but I can't, as this was maybe 6 or 7 years back. I remember it being reported on Lohan Channel 12 News. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. 2 of them died on impact, and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the '60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after, to be a warning to all. My family has a similar story, and I'm pretty sure some of you serial killer buffs out there might figure out who it is before the reveal, because their story is pretty unique. When my parents were in college, they went on a trip down to Florida. They had met through mutual friends and were down there together, but hadn't gone on a date yet. My dad and one of his friends were planning to meet my mom and some of her friends at a hotel, but being the carefree college guys they were, they lost track of time and realized it was impossible to get to the hotel on time by walking. They decided the best solution to their problem was to hitchhike, and a car with two women picked him up. Everything seemed fine until the driver asked them if it was okay to stop for gas. My dad and his friend agreed it was no problem since they were making good time, and she drove into a gas station. She then pumped her car full of gas before hopping back in and flooring it, basically stealing the gas with two hitchhikers in the back. My dad and his friend were beginning to freak out when she pulled a gun from under her seat and asked, "Are we gonna have a problem or something like that?" My dad and his friend shook their heads vehemently, because what else do you do in that situation? She then drove them to the hotel and dropped them off without so much as a scratch, and they kinda thought nothing of it until the news started reporting on a serial killer in Florida known as Aileen Wuornos. He took one look at her picture and instantly recognized her as the driver. The only reason my dad thinks she didn't straight up kill them was because they were super polite and respectful to her, and her victims were usually scumbag guys trying to take advantage of her. TL. Dr. Aileen Wuornos is the reason my dad got to his first date with mom on time. Have you heard of the Nazi so bad that other Nazis, in particular fellow SS Nazis, constantly tried to get him and his unit disbanded and arrested? No? Well, his name was Oscar de la Hoya, and his unit was nicknamed the Black Hunters or the de la Hoya Brigade. Oscar de la Hoya was an early adopter of the Nazi Party. He had been thrown in jail before for being a pedophile. Eventually, when World War II broke out and healthy ideal Germans were dying in droves on the Eastern Front, Oscar's old pal Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, granted him a command of a unit made up originally of German poachers and eventually German criminals being held in civilian jails/camps and military criminals. His unit was essentially designated as a rearguard unit meant to hunt down enemy partisans, or in most cases civilians in occupied countries. Oscar de la Hoya SS unit was responsible for many atrocities. Some atrocities so barbaric and bad other SS units reported him and his unit for atrocities. A few examples, which have been popularized in film, include taking an entire village in Belarus and putting them in a church, locking the doors, and setting the church ablaze. Anyone who tried to escape was shot by machine guns and rifles. This unit raped, tortured, and murdered its way through Eastern and Central Europe. During the Warsaw Uprising they were sent to help squelch the uprising. One of their atrocities committed was going into a children's hospital, telling the nurses and staff that they were there to secure the church. Okay. Once the church was secured, they raped the female staff and some of the wounded and sick female children victims, and then went around shooting everyone. If anyone was found to have survived, they were bayoneted. These guys were so horrible that other Nazis looked down their noses at them and constantly filed complaints and reports against them, but with no real success. Thankfully, by the end of the war this unit was destroyed, and its leaders and criminal soldiers were hunted down like rabid animals. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more daily 9 PM Reddit uploads.